This is book 2 and a little bit of book 3 from Plato's Republic. You might recall that we looked a little bit at the allegory of the cave from Plato, which also comes from the larger text, the Republic. But in this part of the text, I want us to think about how Plato is actually creating society and how this might actually help us understand a little bit about our own current democratic republic, if you will. So, let's go ahead and let's begin. All right then, let's devise a theoretical education for these people, as if we were making up a story and weren't worried about time. Yes, that's a good idea. How shall we educate them then? Or is it hard to improve upon the educational system which has evolved over a long period of time? This, as you know, consists of exercise for the body and cultural studies for the mind. Yes. And shall we begin the cultural program before the physical one? Of course. Cultural studies include literature, don't you think? I asked. I do. Well, aren't there two kinds of literature? True and false? Yes. Should we include both kinds in our educational system and start with the untrue kind? I don't understand what you're getting at, he said. Don't you realize, I asked, that we start by telling children stories which are, by and large, untrue, though they contain elements of truth, and stories precede physical exercise in our education of children. True. Which is why I suggested that cultural studies should be taken up before physical exercise. It was a good suggestion, he said. Now, do you appreciate that the most important stage of any enterprise is the beginning, especially when something young and sensitive is involved? You see, that's when most of its formation takes place, and it absorbs every impression that anyone wants to stamp upon it. You're absolutely right. Shall we then casually allow our children to listen to any old stories, made up by just anyone, and to take into their minds views which, on the whole, contradict those we'll want them to have as adults? No, we won't allow that at all. And that's not all, I said. The stories which have gods fighting and scheming and battling against one another are utterly unsuitable too, because they're just as untrue. If the prospective guardians of our community are to loathe casual quarrels with one another, we must take good care that battles between gods and giants and all the other various tales of gods and heroes coming to blows with their relatives and friends don't occur in these stories they hear and the pictures they see. No, if we're somehow to convince them that fellow citizens never fall out with one another, that this is wrong, then that is the kind of story they must hear from childhood onwards from the community's elders of both sexes. And the poets they'll hear when they're older must be forced to tell equivalent stories in their poetry. But we'd better not admit into our community the story of Hera being tied up by her son, or the episode when Hephaestus is hurled away by his father for trying to save his mother from a beating, or any of the battles between the gods which Homer has in his poetry, whether or not their intention is allegorical. The point is that a young person can't tell when something is allegorical and when it isn't, and any idea admitted by a person of that age tends to become almost ineradicable and permanent. All things considered, then, that is why a very great deal of importance should be placed upon ensuring that the first stories they hear are best adapted for their moral improvement. Yes, that makes sense, he said, but suppose we were once again to be asked, in this context as well, what stories we meant. How would we respond? Adamantus, I said, you and I are not making up stories at the moment. We're founding a community. Founders ought to know the broad outlines within which their poets are to compose stories, so that they can exclude any compositions which do not conform to those outlines. But they shouldn't themselves make up stories. You're right, he said, but that's precisely the point. What are these guidelines for talking about the gods? They'd be something like this, I said. Whatever the type of poetry, epic, lyric, or tragic, God must of course always be portrayed as he really is. Yes, he must. Well, isn't God good? In fact, and shouldn't he be described as such? Of course. And nothing good is harmful, is it? I don't think so. Now, can anything harmless cause damage? No, of course not. Can anything incapable of causing damage do anything bad? Again, no. And something which never does bad couldn't be responsible for bad, could it? Of course not. Well now, is goodness beneficial? Yes. And it's responsible for doing good then? Yes. So goodness is not responsible for everything, it's responsible for things that are in a good state, but bad things cannot be attributed to it. Exactly, he said. The same goes for God too then, I said. Since he is good, he cannot be responsible for everything, as is commonly said. He is responsible only for a small part of human life, and many things cannot be attributed to him. I mean, there's far more bad than good in the world. He and he alone must be held responsible for the good things, but responsibility for bad things must be looked for elsewhere, and not attributed to God. I think you're absolutely right, he said. So, I said, we shouldn't connive at Homer or any other poet making the stupid mistake of saying about the gods, 2 jars sit on Zeus's threshold, one is full of good destinies, but the other is full of wretched destinies, and that if Zeus mixes the 2 up together and doles them out to someone, that person sometimes meets with bad, sometimes with good, whereas if he doesn't mix them up, but allots the pernicious ones to someone in an unadulterated form, that person is driven over the glorious earth by the evil of poverty. Nor will we connive at them claiming that Zeus is the dispenser of both good and evil. Moreover, we'll disapprove of the attribution of Pandarus's perjury and truce-breaking to the agency of Athena and Zeus, and of the gods' quarrel and its resolution to Themis and Zeus, and will not allow the younger generation to hear the idea which Aeschylus expresses as, when God wants to visit utter ruin on a household, he implants the cause in men. No. If plays are composed, such as the one these lines are from, about Niobe's afflictions, or about the trials and tribulations of the descendants of Pelops, or about the Trojan War, the playwrights must either be prohibited from saying that God was responsible for these events, or if they do attribute them to God, they have to come up with an explanation which approximates to the one we're looking for at the moment, and say that what God did was right and good, in the sense that the people in question were being punished and therefore benefited. But poets should be prohibited from saying that these people were in a bad way as a result of being punished, and that this was God's doing. The claim that the sinners were badly off because they were in need of punishment, and that in punishing them God was benefiting them, is permissible. But the claim that God, who is good, is responsible for any instance of badness is to be resisted as forcefully as possible by anyone who wants a well-regulated community until it is never spoken and never heard by anyone of whatever age, whether the tale is told in verse or in prose. And the reasons are that the voicing of these views is sacrilege. They do us no good, and they are inconsistent with one another. I approve of this law, he said. I'll be right behind you when you cast your vote for it. So now we have the first of the laws and guidelines which pertain to the gods, I said. Any spoken words or composed works will have to conform to the principle that God is not responsible for everything, but only for good. Well, I'm certainly happy with it, he said. All right, then. What about a second principle as follows? Do you think that God is a sorcerer and can be exercising his will, vary his appearance from time to time, sometimes by actually changing and transforming his appearance into a large number of forms, and at other times be by deluding us into thinking that's what he's done? Or do you think he's uniform and extremely unlikely to abandon his own appearance? I'm not in a position to say just at the moment, he replied. Look at it this way. Isn't it inevitable that if anything sheds its form, the change is due either to itself or to something else? Yes. Now, really good things are extremely unlikely to be altered or moved by an external agent, aren't they? For instance, a human body is altered by food, drink, and exercise, and plants are altered by the heat of the sun, and by wind and phenomena like that. But the more healthy and strong a thing is, the less likely it is to be altered. Of course. And the more courageous and intelligent a mind is, the less likely it is that an external agent would disturb it and alter it. Yes. Moreover, the same principle applies universally, even to manufactured items, such as utensils, houses, and clothes. Things which are well made and are in good condition are less likely to be altered by time and other phenomena. Well, true. So anything which is in a good state, whether that is due to nature or human skill or both, can hardly be changed at all by an external agent. That sounds right. But God and the divine realm are, of course, in all respects, as perfect as anything can be. Well, of course. From this point of view, then, God is extremely unlikely to have at his disposal a large number of forms. Yes, extremely unlikely indeed. Would he, however, change and alter himself internally by his own resources? If he changes in the first place, he said, then obviously this must be how. Well, does he enhance and improve himself, or does he worsen and debase himself? If he changes, he said, then it must be for the worse, since it's unthinkable that God's goodness and excellence are anything less than perfect. You're absolutely right, I said. And Adeimantus, in this context, do you think that anyone, human or divine, deliberately makes himself deteriorate in any respect? That's impossible, he said. It is equally impossible then, I said, for God to want to change himself, since as we have found, the divine nature is as perfect and as good as anything could be. Then any God retains his own form in a uniform, direct fashion forever. I think that's absolutely inevitable, he said. It follows, Adeimantus, I said, that none of our poets is to say, the gods travel around human habitations disguised as all sorts of visitors from other lands. Nor are they to tell lies about Proteus and Thetis, or present Hera in a tragedy or any other kind of poem in an altered form, as a mendicant, holy woman begging alms for the life-giving children of the Argive river Inachus, or repeat the mass of other similar lies that have been told. Furthermore, we should neutralize the poet's influence on mothers, which makes them scare their children with terrible stories about how some gods tend to prowl around during the hours of darkness in a wide variety of unfamiliar human guises, so that we stop the mothers blaspheming against the gods, and at the same time stop them making their children too timid. Yes, we should, he said. But even if it isn't in the gods' nature actually to change, I said, do they magically delude us into seeing them appear in all kinds of guises? It's not inconceivable, he said. Well, would God willingly mask the truth behind appearance and deceive us by his words or actions, I asked. I don't know, he answered. Don't you know that a true falsehood, if you'll allow me the phrase, is loathed by everyone, divine or human, I asked. What do you mean? He asked. I mean, I said, that no one chooses and wants to be deceived in the most important part of himself, and about the most important things. The presence of falsehood there is his worst fear. I still don't understand, he said. That's because you think I'm trying to make a high-powered point, I said, but all I'm saying is that no one is at all happy at being lied to and deceived in his mind about the facts. No one likes being ignorant, and the existence and presence of falsehood there are extremely unwelcome to everyone. They particularly hate it there. They certainly do, he said. Well, I might have been perfectly correct when I described this state a moment ago as true falsehood, the state of misapprehension caused by falsehood in the mind. I mean, a spoken lie is a kind of copy and subsequent reflection of the mental condition, and no pure lie, do you think? Yes. Now, a genuine lie is hated by men as well as gods. I think so. What about a spoken lie? Aren't there occasions and situations when telling lies is helpful, and doesn't therefore warrant hatred? What about when we're dealing with enemies or with people we count as friends, but who are trying to do something bad because they've gone mad or have somehow taken leave of their senses. Isn't telling lies helpful under those circumstances as a preventative medicine? Moreover, consider those stories we were discussing not long ago. We cannot know the truth about events in the past, so we make something up which approximates as closely as possible to the truth, and that helps us, doesn't it? Yes, he said. You're quite right. Which of these reasons, then, makes telling lies helpful to God? Would he make up something which resembles the truth because he doesn't know the past? That's a ridiculous suggestion, he said. So there's nothing of the lying poet in God? I don't think so. Would he lie out of fear for his enemies? Hardly. Because his friends have taken leave of their senses or gone mad? Anyone witless or insane is no friend of God, he said. So God has no reason to lie. No. So it is not in the nature of deities or gods to deceive. Absolutely not, he said. Whether acting or speaking, then, God is entirely uniform and truthful. He doesn't actually change himself, and he doesn't delude others either, during their sleeping or their waking hours, in how he appears or in what he says or in the signs he sends. Listening to you speak, he said, I find myself agreeing with you. So do you agree, I said, that this is the second principle to which religious discussions and literature must conform? That the gods are not shape-shifting wizards and do not mislead us by lying in what they say or do? I agree. Although there is much to commend in Homer, then, we won't approve of the passage when Zeus sends the dream to Agamemnon. Likewise, we won't approve of the bit of Aeschylus, where Thetis says that at her wedding Apollo celebrated in song how happy my children would make me, how they wouldn't know sickness and would live for many long years, and went on and on about how lucky I was and how the god smiled on me until he made my heart glad. And since Phoebus is a god and abounds in prophetic skill, I expected his words to be true. But for all his singing, for all his sharing of our feast, for all these claims of his, it is he who has now killed my son. We'll come down hard on anyone who says anything like this about the gods. We'll refuse him a chorus and ban teachers from using his works to educate our children. Otherwise, our guardians won't grow up to be religious people, or to be as godlike themselves as humanly possible. I'm in complete agreement with these principles, he said, and would want them enshrined as laws.